Dixon.
I'm going to take us away. All right, well, let's start with a prayer here. And it's been our prayer. It's from the prayer book. It's one of the collects regarding Holy Scripture, which is lovely. And it always is appropriate for a Bible study, I feel like. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all Holy Scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. All right, so we're in week 3 of our Sunday school stories through grown-up eyes. We are today going to do Noah and the Ark, Noah's Ark, as it's frequently referred to. And we're going to talk about whether that's the appropriate name for it at the end of this. And then next week, we're going to do the Tower of Babel. We're going to conclude with the Tower of Babel, and we'll have done basically most of Genesis 1 through 11, which is appropriate. So again, we're kind of launching in, and what I'm hoping is that this class has stirred up your imagination and given you some fresh insights. I'm going to try to be a little less like fire hosey this week to maybe get a little more dialogue going, but we'll see. The heart wants what the heart wants, and sometimes the preacher just can't keep his mouth shut. I didn't get to say anything during the service, and so I have to get it all in here.
Good job being quiet. I'm interested to see the comment section in the video.
I was super nice. I was very kind. I didn't sass y'all. All right, so listen. So today, we're going to start by talking about Noah's Ark, but I'm kind of interested. Is there anything that over the last 2 weeks you remember, or you have kept with you? You've thought about. What are some of the things that have surfaced in the last 2 weeks that you've held on to? I'd be really just interested to hear things that have been meaningful, that may even have a role this week. And you can drop them in the comments field, or you can raise a hand and Sarah can call on you.
In the chat, Stacy just put up that the idea that the mark of Cain was a mark of protection.
Yeah, kind of cool.
Yeah,
good. And I think too, just to comment on that, Stacy, I think that was, you might have even commented on that last week, and it's one of those things that like it surfaced because we read the whole story, right? It wasn't like fragments and pieces. It was like and you're like, oh, I had sort of carried an intuition about this story that actually wasn't true in the face of it. We're going to do that today, I hope, with the flood story.
I was going to offer that what stuck with me is from the first class on the creation story. It never occurred to me, really never sunk in with me, that the creation story was a conversation against and toward other creation narratives, toward that had been other ancient stories of other gods, and that our creation story is distinct, and what it says about the God of Israel is distinct. Just never had put that in a larger context before.
That's so cool, Sarah. You know, I didn't know that stuff until I engaged this story for this week. Like the Noah's Ark was the first place that I was like, oh, there's this other thing going on, and then realized that was actually true in other places as well. And that'll be something that we talk about obviously going forward, but also, you know, it starts to let you know, oh, these ancient authors were like up to a lot. And sometimes when we charge in with contemporary assumptions about what these stories are supposed to be telling us, or questions, or even I would say, like, you know, as we talked about with Genesis 1, you know, assumptions that like, oh, they plagiarized that, you know, and so somehow its connection to another story diminishes its authority or makes it like, you know, not as credible. That's a really particular set of judgments and values that we are overlaying on the text that may demonstrate our ignorance more than the text. If I can just put too fine a point on it. One more maybe? if there is one. All right. Well, in the face of that, let's move forward into this week, because we are going to talk about Noah's Ark. And I put two pictures up here that in the slide. You may be familiar with items like this. My kids had something like this. Both of these, incidentally, are designed to float in a bathtub, and are kind of made for play. Um, and I think when I imagined the purpose of Noah's Ark, right, that story, this is sort of what I thought. It's like this colorful kind of story that we remember from childhood. It's all the animals are there, and Noah, and God saved everybody. And so I'm interested. What do you already know about this story? And that can include questions or even kind of learnings that you've accrued in the years since you were a kid. What's the story about?
This is Malcolm. It seems to me that there were a lot of flood stories back then, and I just wonder how we put that all together. They don't have Noah in them, but there probably was a major flood at some time that was passed down through the ages and got into these stories.
Love it. Yes, yeah, Malcolm, thank you. Like, such a good wondering. Like, first off, are there other flood stories? And if there are, do they look similar or differently to the Jewish story? And then second point, was there ever a flood? Like, is a flood story kind of like just a trope, or was there an event? Such a good question. Other things or wonderings you bring.
Stacy put in the chat, I think this was a quote from the first class, that this flood story is the unmaking of creation. It is the antithesis to Genesis 1 through 2.
Awesome. And Stacy mentions that because we talked about the way that there are these design patterns that these texts are set up to continually replay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, there's like, when you see, we're going to read this whole thing, when you see language that makes you remember a previous story like Genesis 1, and you're seeing like pay attention, is the same thing happening or is it the opposite thing happening? And as Stacy is noticing, yeah, there might be something in this where this flood is about the unmaking of creation. Very much, we talked about how the 10 speech acts of Genesis 1 were the 10 commands that created the world, and then that paralleled both the giving of the 10 words at Sinai, where God creates Israel, and then the 10 plagues on Egypt, where God uncreates Egypt. So all of those are supposed to go together and kind of ring in the mind of the hearer. Good stuff. And then the question at the end, it will be, of course, should we ever have Playmobil wildlife Noah's Ark stories? We'll see. Because sometimes the hardest stories to hear, and to basically the hardest stories to read with ancient eyes are the ones we're most familiar with. And this is definitely one of those. Remember a couple of things to keep in mind while we read it. We talked about the design patterns that Stacy brought up. We talked a little bit about how these ancient writers are asking really different questions and have different agendas than modern readers will bring to these texts. And sometimes modern readers have tended to dismiss these texts because they did not answer questions about like scientific origins of the earth, or the actual kind of like journalist camcorder history of the beginning of things, and so they've dismissed them. And you could maybe miss what's actually going on. Also, don't forget that this is written down. These stories existed as oral tradition, written down during and right after the exile. And so that context is overlaid into all of them. And Genesis is meant to be read as part of the entire Torah. the instruction. And so these stories all cascade into and against each other. There will be references to things in these early stories of Genesis that haven't yet happened, but the people that are writing them have already experienced them, so they write them back into these early stories as they sort of tell the history. Like, for example, last week with Cain and Abel, both of their sacrifices mirrored appropriate sacrifices in Torah. Abel's was what you were supposed to sacrifice according to Torah and Leviticus, and Cain's was not. And that's something that, in the linear progression of the story, you wouldn't see, but they knew that already, and they're writing all that into these texts, which just makes them so much richer. All right, so we're going to read the flood. I encourage you, if you have a notebook or something to write on, or your phone, like, take notes about what sticks out to you. What are the questions that you have? What is offensive, troubling, or cliche? There's probably going to be some of that in this story. And remember that, kind of like with what Stacey was noting before about Cain and Abel, we're going to read this whole thing. This is 4 chapters of the Bible. They're not long chapters, but we're going to read the story in its entirety. And I want you to pay attention. Do new things surface for you when you're not just hearing a portion of it, and or pulling a Playmobil bath toy out for your kid or grandkid and being like, Noah's Ark. So here we go. Oh, let me try to minimize. I hate this. I need to minimize the window so I can see what I'm reading here. All right. Did you get it? Oh, I did. I sort of did. All right. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the, oh, I got the wrong slide. I'm starting bad. Oh man. Okay, hold on. Here's what we're going to do. Why did I have the wrong slide in there? That's a problem. Oh boy. Hold on, everybody. Take a break. Looks like I pulled that Genesis 1 slide in there and missed it. Okay, what we're going to do, let me talk amongst yourselves for a moment.
It looks like you've got the like a good amount of the scripture.
Yeah.
You're just missing the beginning of it.
Yeah, it looks like I pasted it in weird. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read this to you all just off a website. And so you're going to join me. Join me at Bible Gateway, everyone. Here we go. And I'm using the New International Version, which is not the version that we use in church, but because it is written in a way that particularly surfaces some of the troubling notions of this story. So
if we wanted to follow along in our own Bibles at home, you're in Genesis 6?
6, yeah. Okay. It will go Genesis 6 through 9. We'll read part of 9.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, good call. All right. Here we go. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, that every inclination of their thoughts, of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourselves an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof of an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark. You and your sons and your wives and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird and every kind of animal, and 2 of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you with them. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. The Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and a female, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds, of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark, as God had commanded Noah. And after the 7 days, the floodwaters came to the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were open, and rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kinds, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on earth. And as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark floated to the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on the land perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground, and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and rain had stopped falling from the sky. The waters receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came and rested on the mountain of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. After 40 days, Noah opened a window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch because there was water all over the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the waters had dried up from the earth. Noah had removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month of the earth was completely dry. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." So Noah came out, Noah, whatever, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land came out of the ark, one kind after another. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy the living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky and on every creature that moves along the ground and all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, now I give you everything. But you must not eat meat that still has lifeblood in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being, too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth, and increase upon it." Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, the wild animals, and those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on the earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I'm making between you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the cloud, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth." And so God said to Noah, "This is a sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on earth." The word of the Lord.
No.
All right. That's some Bible right there, kids. So give me some feedback. What are things that stuck out to you in that reading? What are things that were troubling? What are things you've never seen before? And just, yeah, I see Kathy's hand, but feel free to unmute or throw up a chat. Kathy, what do you got?
I had not noticed before that God and Noah were concerned about species going extinct. He wanted to make sure everything was there. And that implies to me that he knew that they all had a purpose. I've never seen or heard that before in my reading of it.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Other observations?
Yeah, because it's gonna be tougher.
There's no message of the fish and the things in the sea, and also insects. I mean, it seems to me he's talking about mammals basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, Malcolm, because the fish and stuff, you would think they're in the ocean, right? So they're like accounted for in this, but the swarmers are not, and the swarmers are certainly part of the plague cycle and some other things. That's actually, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but that's a really cool observation. Yeah. Or maybe it's just because God knows that like mosquito season is the worst, and God's like, let's look. But bonus for you guys, now that we've run this thing for a while, insects do stink. What if we got rid of them?
So Sally Morris Randall just wrote in the chat the kind of general sentiment of the wickedness of humans on earth, violence, and just things never change. Sally, I'm kind of with you. I was kind of meditating as Dixon was reading how much I hadn't noticed before how much this is just a natural disaster, like an extreme situation of incredible suffering. I think it kind of hit home to me when the dove enters in, and they are just like it's almost like they're sending out a flare, like help us. This is our last ditch chance to send out this bird that we could probably like kill and eat and survive on, and instead we're going to send it out hoping that the flood is coming to an end.
That's so helpful too. Like, I think a lot of times this story gets told like it's the Lion King, it's like animating kids, but it's not like the Lion King. It's like 28 days later, or Contagion. I mean, this, yeah, you put it in that context, Sarah, you're like, oh my gosh, like this, like what an intense, hardcore kind of story.
But then what about God in the creation creates Adam and Eve, and they get sent out of the garden into the earth. But then all of a sudden we have these Nephilim creatures coming down from up above. I that's something I'd forgotten.
I was wondering, I was like, somebody's got to bring up the Nephilim. I mean, come on, that thing is so weird. I just say a little bit about it. There is more to be said about it, but one of the things about that, and this is from Genesis 6, where they're talking about like the sons of God married human women and created this race of giants, right? So there's a couple of things going on here. Number one, the word married is actually the Hebrew word to take. It's lakah, which is what Adam and Eve did with the apple. So it's another extension of the rebellion narrative of Genesis 3, but apparently this rebellion is not just human related. There are these sort of spiritual beings in this creation that also have a propensity to rebel against God. The serpent looks like one of them when it shows up in Genesis 3. Like, what is that thing? Like, it's not one of the things that God created in the Genesis, the first chapter. So you're like what are there are these parts of the creation that are like kind of some again heavenly beings. And the thing that's interesting is like what the author is trying to show with this Nephilim. Well, first of all, I should say this too. All of the nations around Israel at the time had their kings believe that they were gods, which is probably familiar, right? And there were narratives and myths about them, about how they were the one true God, like the ruler of Assyria, the ruler of Babylon, these kind of legitimating myths. And many of them had stories about their lineage being a fusing of the human and the divine. Like this is like Greek mythology, like Hercules' dad is Zeus and his mom is, a human woman or whatever. So like that, those stories were in the ancient world too. And so part of what the Genesis authors are doing is like, yeah, those all those people that are claiming to be sort of demigods, they're false gods. And part of the inversion is that when Adam and Eve are meant to, when they're tempted to take the fruit off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the serpent tells them they'll be like God. And so it's this like merging of divine and human outside of God's plan. This is the flip. It's the merging of divine and human, but not from the human toward the divine, but from the divine toward the human. Also in rebellion. So it's like about this sort of totality of brokenness. And there's more to say about all that too, but that's some of what's going on with the Nephilim and that whole thing. But listen, there's been a lot of ink spilled about that.
There's a couple of comments in the comment section. I can just bring them up real quick. Karen observed that this is one of the rare moments when God's human side shows, when he shows his regret over what was done.
Yeah. Anybody else notice that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
And then Gail has a question about the 7 pair of everything. It said 1 male and 1 female. So what does 7 pair mean? I didn't quite catch that.
I noticed that in the reading, Gail. I think that's interesting. I would guess, and I'm not looking at the text, but I think it's about like the totality of like the completion of the pairs. Remember, in Hebrew consciousness, numbers are symbolic, not quantitative. Mm-hmm. So it's showing us the the animal pairs that went in were full, complete, sufficient examples of their kind and species.
Right.
That's, I think, and sort of saying like God's kind of to Kathy's point. We got one of everything, in this story. But again, it's not trying to do it's not asking questions about trying to solve questions of history or science about how exactly did you do that and how do you know you got them all. It's like it's doing something different. So that's actually a helpful thing. Okay. Did I catch all the comments, Sarah?
Let's see. I think you answered Joyce Ma's question. She says, my understanding is the Nephilim were the fallen angels.
Right.
But that we just had that conversation. And then Stacy says, has a question. Is this the first covenant?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, is this it? Maybe what you mean, Stacy, is like, is this the first covenant that God has had with the people? Period in the Bible.
First mention.
Yeah,
I think it is.
Right.
I think it is.
Yeah, and of course it's.
I mean, unless you count like sort of the relationship that God had with human beings in the garden as a covenant, and that covenant was broken with the eating of the apple and the dispelling from the garden. But it wasn't a defined covenant. It was more like the relationship.
And that was with individuals too. Because I was thinking also with Cain, that was more with an individual, I think.
Yeah, instead of all of the people of Israel. Yeah.
But they're definitely like lacing in, because covenants of like after Genesis 11, Abraham shows up and everything changes. And so they're lacing that narrative notion in.
I was touched by the amazing destructive power of God in the story. Some little boy said to me one time in a class, he said, "You mean God killed all the puppies too?"
Oh.
So I thought maybe he shouldn't. Maybe this is a little bit too early for him to be hearing about Noah's Ark, but it is the destructive power of God is here.
Oh yeah.
So let me just go from there into the rest of this and offer some stuff. That's such a good observation. And I think it's like Lauren and Sarah and I all walked into the building at the same time this morning. And I was like, Lauren, I should have you on this call to justify how you teach this to kids. Like, how do you handle all of these details, And what usually happens is we strip out a lot of this stuff. I mean, basically the story becomes there was a flood and God provided a way for a family to survive. And then when the floodwaters receded, they were able to send out the bird. And then the rainbow is there because God protects us, right? And you're like, Yes, but there's some selective omissions, because kids can't. I mean, this is intense, right? I mean, there's a lot going on in here. Let me show you guys some stuff that I think will help in looking at this, and we'll move forward. So the first thing is that most scholars do believe that there was a flood, that there had been some time in the kind of antiquity, like a really significant, massive flood that they surmise around maybe 2900 BCE, something that really wiped a lot of humanity out. And remember too, like in the ancient world, like this was how they saw the world. It was what's called a three-tier universe, where you've got like the heavens are above, which is like the sky, and then you've got the land that we're living on, and then the underworld, like the earth and the land, and then the underworld was underneath it. And remember, even Sheol was thought to be a watery place. Well, why? Because there's like basically water everywhere. It was all like the waters of chaos. And so the picture they had was that God had kind of made a snow globe in the middle of all this chaotic water to create order and safety and life. And part of how God did that was through separation and distinction, and then to keep the snow globe from like floating around. You see those pillars. Those are the pillars of the earth. That's what they thought. The foundations of the earth are like God set the earth on these foundations that God holds to keep it steady and keep things like they're meant to be, so the waters of chaos don't overtake it, right? And so when water came about and wiped out the world, from what you didn't really see much of what was beyond like what you could just see. Like people didn't travel, there weren't airplanes, right? And so if you kind of were standing in the midst of a flood that overtook all that you could see, it would feel like it was worldwide. And so because of that, lots of ancient stories surfaced about floods and about worldwide floods, and that is some of the genesis, to pardon the confusing word, of where these flood stories happen, or where they came from. But the thing about them is, what they're interested in doing is they were interested not in talking about like how the flood had happened, but why did it happen? Like there was something that these flood stories, the character that they took on was to describe what was one of the true natures of the universe, what were the gods like, because most people were polytheists, and what was the nature of the relationship between the gods and humanity, such that something like this can happen, right? I mean, we see this all the time. There's a natural disaster, you've got Hurricane Katrina, you've got the tsunami in 2004, and a bunch of like religious people show up and they're like, let me tell you what God is doing here. Usually it's not helpful. I have a lot of opinions about that. But it was the same in the ancient world. And that's kind of where these stories come from. Now, there are lots of them. And some of the oldest versions are from Sumeria, Assyria, and Babylon. And Babylon, again, should ring a bell for you, because when Israel is writing down their flood story, they're in Babylon. And so kind of like Genesis 1, we might not be surprised to see that there might be some overlaps. They may be playing with this form in order to make some points, okay? And so the two kind of significant flood stories that were Babylonian, they're involved one of Atrahasis, and then the other is Gilgamesh. The Atrahasis flood story basically was about the high god of weather, Enlil, and Enlil wants to destroy human beings because they're making too much noise. Basically, he's the Grinch, and the earth is Whoville. And so Atrahasis, with the help of the water god Ea, escaped the wrath of Enlil by building a huge boat. Okay, so the water god's like, I don't like what he's up to, and so tips off Atrahasis, builds a boat. Atrahasis survives. Now, the other one that is familiar, that looks a lot like the Genesis story we read, is from the Gilgamesh epic. And we talked, that was the one that was overlapping with Genesis 1 so consistently. And basically, Gilgamesh was an actual historical figure. He's like the king of Uruk, but kind of became like like a Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone figure, like took on, and this is what kings of the ancient world would do, like let themselves be wrapped in a mythology. Actually, it's more similar to like what the sort of state propaganda around like Kim Jong-il or Vladimir Putin. You'll see where like these kind of like fantastic stories surface about them. People are like, Vladimir Putin absolutely went scuba diving and pulled up all this treasure, and state TV told me. And so that's been a kind of a common thing. Basically in the Gilgamesh epic about the flood, essentially you've got a character named Enkidu, and Gilgamesh, he's a friend of Gilgamesh, and his friend dies, and Enkidu dies. And so Gilgamesh is like, oh, I should be afraid of death. I didn't know that was something to be afraid of before. And so he goes on a quest to see if he can find immortality. His quest leads him to Utnapishtim, parents still having children. Consider Utnapishtim. And this is like the Noah figure in this story. So Gilgamesh goes to him and is like, hey, you obtained immortality. How did you do it? And Utnapishtim is like, here's how it worked. Basically, I survived this huge flood. We don't really know in this story what led to the flood. Some people actually ascribe some, like, was the sinfulness of humanity, and Utnapishtim survives it because of that. But the way he survives it is that he builds a boat, and it's a square boat. It has specific dimensions. It has at least one window. It has one door, and that door is covered in pitch tar to keep it watertight. Utnapishtim took only his family on the boat. All species of animals. Rains were the cause of the flood, and after the waters recede, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on Mount Nasir, where he releases a raven, swallow, and a dove to find land when they get out. And then when he gets out, Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice to Ea, the water god, and is blessed, right? So does anybody see any similarities between these two stories? Yeah, there's like a couple, right? And so the question is like what is it? How do you reconcile, like, what are you supposed to look for when you see a story like the Gilgamesh flood story with Utnapishtim and the story of Genesis, and they're so similar? You've probably all heard people that are like, oh my gosh, you can tell that the Genesis story was plagiarized and it came later than the Babylonian one. And so that's why we can throw it out and not listen to it, right? But that would be actually an ignorant assumption about this, because it's fundamentally missing what's going on. And to understand what's going on, I got to play guitar for you. Are you ready for this? The good news is I can't see any of your faces. Actually, let me minimize my thing so I can see you. All right, so basically, flood stories, all right? Flood stories are like 12-bar blues. Can everybody hear that? Okay, can you hear how out of tune it is? You know what? It's good enough for rock and roll. Okay, so here's how it works. So if you don't know about the blues, the most classic form of the blues is called the 12-bar blues. And that is a song structure that is on the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord of a major scale. And it goes like this. I'm going to count it for you, okay? So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oh, it's so bad. So that's the 12 bars. And has anyone ever heard a song with those 12 bars? Yeah, probably so. I think it's the B string section. So what's interesting about the blues, if you listen to the blues, is that the 12 bars are in every blues song. It's how blues songs are structured. It's what makes a song the blues, is that it plays the 12 bars, right? But what's interesting is when you find people like B.B. King playing the 12 bars, he'll play it like this. He'll be like, it's all kind of slow. He has these little pull-offs. So he plays it, and it's got this like, there's a lot of space in it, and there's a lot of like character and soul, like kind of mournful soul in the way he plays it. All right. But you'll also find this 12-bar blues in Johnny Cash, particularly a song like Folsom Prison Blues, right? So instead of, Johnny Cash speeds it up. Luther Perkins. That's also, it's a 12, he runs the whole song, 12 bars, same pattern, but a completely different feel based on the way he varies it. Do you see what I'm talking about with that? Do you hear that difference? All right, and then you have people like Stevie Ray Vaughan, right, who takes it and like ramps up the intensity of it, and adds this like Texas swagger to it. So you have a song like Pride and Joy. And it has like a boogie. Now, there's no space in that. Like Stevie is playing all the time, everywhere, to show you what he can do. But here's my point. Flood stories in the ancient world were like the 12-bar blues, right? The form is the same. What makes it interesting and what you're supposed to pay attention to is the flourish that the artist puts on it. It's the difference that they make in how they play it that makes it a B.B. King song versus a Johnny Cash song versus a Stevie Ray Vaughan song, right? And that's some of how this thing goes in the ancient world with flood stories. So all of these similarities that you see between these two stories, you're meant to see them, and you're meant to start noticing the differences that these Hebrew authors are putting into their story that don't exist in the other one. It's very similar to what we saw in Genesis 1, right? So like, for example, as Stacy mentioned before, if the world is a snow globe and like affixed in its place by pillars in great murky waters that are above and below it, right? Well, when those waters come crashing back down into this creation, well, then it's like this reversing of Genesis 1 and 2. It's like an uncreating. Things are moving back to chaos, where there had been order that God had made that had been holy and good. Sin and death have so corrupted this thing that violence is out of control. And God's like, it's time to start over, right? So God lets the creation move back to its wild and waste state of tohu vavohu. And actually, there's another point about this that I'll make in a second, but well, no, I'll make it now. So the thing that's important to recognize, though, is that God does not destroy the world. In the flood story, God allows it to take on the chaotic form that it keeps asking for through its rebellion, right? God lets it have its way. Because in these ancient stories, what you see is that the goodness in this world and like the stability and foundation of it, like think about those pillars, those are God's sustaining power. If God removes God's self and lets it go on its way without God, then it will careen towards self-destruction and death. And so there's something in this flood story where you're seeing God very, very much let creation have its own way. It's like, you guys want it to be a creation of violence and death? I'm going to let it be. God allows it to take its course. You see Jesus do this in stories like the parable of the talents, where the wicked servant that doesn't do something with the talents that they've been given is like, well, I knew that you, master, I knew you were a hard man who, reaps where he does not sow. And, and it's like, I knew you were awful. And so I had to be afraid. And he's like, that's what you thought I was like? Okay, if you want it that way, here's what your life looks like. So that's happening in these ancient flood stories as well. Well, we kind of noticed that the language in Genesis 7:11 and the language about the second day in Genesis 1:6, it's all the same vocabulary again in these two verses, which is kind of cool. I'm going to move quickly because we've only got a couple minutes left, and I played too much blues for you. This is a thing that well, I should say this before we move too far forward. You noticed how many people noticed all of the Genesis 1 language in the Noah story, right? There's a lot of it in there, right? Be fruitful and multiply, the same sorts of like vocabulary around how the first 7 days of creation. This is because what God is doing in this is starting new creation, with Noah being the new Adam. It's why at the end of the story, Noah gets off the boat and God gives them the command, be fruitful and multiply. Let's try this thing again, which is actually how it starts in chapter 6. People were being fruitful and multiplying. It's like, oh, this is great. Except what they're multiplying is violence and destruction, right? So almost right, but not quite. Another observation about the differences in these stories. Whereas in the Atrahasis story, the God that brings a flood does it out of annoyance and anger. This is a different scenario here. Is God angry in this story? And no, as you guys already pointed out, what is the motivating feeling that drives the story? It's grief. It's God's regret. This is actually the first time in the story that God is referred to as having feelings or emotions. And the first emotion God feels is regret, is really grief. It's like the kind of feeling that when the people that you love the most, when they let you down, it hurts the most, right? Like the guy that cut you off in the parking lot at Target, you're like, whatever, he's a jerk. But like people that care about you, if they are selfish and betray your trust, it brings this whole different level of complication, right? And so it's important to note that this is not a story about divine anger. In fact, God doesn't actually get angry until God meets Moses. And even in that moment of God's anger, God makes a plan, because Moses won't go talk to Pharaoh and God gets mad. And so he's like, okay, what if I give you Aaron? So it's like, even in God's anger, God's like problem solving. But this is one where, like, as opposed to the ancient world where these gods were angry at human beings and were just disregarding them and they were like a problem, in this story, this God is grieved and is deeply tied to human beings, so much so that this God wants to rescue them and start again. This God is so committed to partnership with human beings to take this creation somewhere that this God will save one family to see if we can start again, right? Which again should be echoes of other things. Last observation, actually two observations. In this flood story, you see the Lord, they make the sacrifice after the flood, and it says, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. When this story begins, human beings are wicked and evil throughout the whole earth, right? When this story ends, are human beings redeemed and saved and different? No, they're the same. Who's different on the other side of the story? God is. There's something that's happened in the heart of God through this story that has changed. This God has been shaped. And you'll see this again, like in places like Jonah, where God like changes God's mind and relents, or even with Sodom and Gomorrah. That's going to come later. But it's really important because in the ancient world, the gods were static. They were fixed. They were not affected by human affairs other than to be irritated by us. Or human beings were created to do their will. Not this God. This God is different. And this God can be moved and is shaped by the affairs of human beings, which is important because when you get to this covenant that God makes, where God puts the rainbow in the sky, right? And it's this reminder that never again will the Lord destroy the earth, which again is kind of basically, this is like a prequel. It's like, oh, our God doesn't destroy. That's not our God's thing. Our God doesn't wipe out the earth like all the other gods. But the rainbow becomes the symbol of it. And it's part of why it's such a great children's story, right? But let me ask you this. Gail Madison, you're on my screen. Gail, what is a bow?
You can.
What is a bow?
Yeah, what's a bow? When you hear the word bow, what is that?
Well, it's a rainbow.
Yeah.
I mean,
what other context does bow show up? Like just in your mind, what else does bow mean? It means rainbow here. What else?
oh, rainbow.
No, rainbow, but also, yeah,
Can
rainbow.
also mean a
Oh,
joining together of people.
Yeah, it
Spelled
can,
a little different, but
that's true. Yeah, like the binding together of people. In this context, yeah, I'm asking. Thanks for let me pick on you. The bow is a weapon of war. And so the rainbow that is in the sky, this is a picture of God hanging up God's weapon. This God is, the fundamental nature of this God toward human beings is not adversarial. It's not violent. That's not what this God does. This God this God is interested in restoring and redeeming humanity, not destroying it. And every time you see the rainbow, you remember that God has hung up God's weapons, as opposed to the gods of old and these other gods, right? So tons of stuff there. These are just some of the observations. And if we had time, you would see that as the story progresses, here we go again with Noah and his sons. So let me stop there and ask for questions. What questions and observations do you have to conclude this class?
I have a question, but it probably is not quickly answered.
That's all right. We could.
So
start.
you could just say, that's too annoying, I'm not answering that.
Is it about the Nephilim?
No, it is about what your final point was before you started talking about the bow, about God is the one that changes.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of a way of talking about God, a particular kind of theology that is not fashionable, called process theology, that has this idea of the notion of God as an entity that has the capacity for change, and that how do you, in kind of making that point about, not just in the Noah story, but also in Jonah, also in other instances, especially in the Old Testament, and also you could argue through the person of Jesus Christ, that God changes and God has emotion. God is empathetic with the people and connected to the creation in a very intense sort of way, and that intensity changes God. How do you deal with that, with the notion of, like, what a lot of people find comforting in that God never changes, that everything in the world can change, but God stays the same, and that's kind of comforting. What would you say to someone that heard that and pushed back on that way? Or you could just say, you're being annoying, let's talk about something else.
Is it someone that doesn't like process theology? Because I've heard that there's somebody I know that doesn't like process theology.
I'm just saying.
It's actually an excellent question, because what I think it does is that binary surfaces some of the way we want to flatten out the character of God in the scriptures to be more uniform, and to sort of I mean, basically it's like we want to feel good about something, and so we want to, I think, ascribe some things to God that may not be ascribable.
Yeah.
And some people will point to like scriptures like Jesus Christ, same yesterday, today, and always. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
What these stories are trying to point out, and I think you're very wise to move this forward into the New Testament and watch Jesus Christ have the same experiences, is that God is not distinct, or is not unmoved or disconnected from this creation. In fact, the worse people are in this creation, and you watch this across the Torah, the more God leans in and tries to bind people closer. And we affect God. Like how the choices that we make and the things that we do impact the divine. That's just the nature of this God. And I would say that nature, yeah, that never changes. So when you're interacting with God, wherever you are, whatever your circumstance is, like the comfort you find in the changelessness of God, absolutely. One of the changeless aspects of this God is the empathy of this God and the pathos of this God.
Mhm.
That is really, really, this is, I mean, part of what the Noah story, the flood story is talking about, is like violence is not okay with this God. We want God to have feelings about that. We want God to have feelings about slavery and injustice. We want God to be angry at those things, even though that anger is slow burning, as the Psalms say.
We want God to be affected by a baby's cry the way that a mother is moved to mother for a child that is suffering, right?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, you see that, right? In these stories about the blood of Abel, the cry that comes out that reaches the Lord over and over. I've heard the cry of my people in Egypt. I've heard. So yeah. So I would not accept the process theology binary. And I think that they might be wanting to sort of maybe over make that point, instead of letting the strangeness of the biblical witness sit on us.
Yeah, and I think what's annoying about process theology is that it actually like seeks to accomplish that which it is speaking against, which is to like try to name in black and white terms, this is God, this is not God. And like
Yeah.
there's no mystery, there's no sense of the relationship of a complex God that occupies an unchangeable space, but is changed within that space. That's what I heard you say.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for going there.
I think too, I think it's actually really useful, Sarah, because it points out again the distinction between good and perfect that we made in the first class.
Sure.
God is good. God is not perfect in that sense of like staticness.
Right.
So even in God's unchangingness, holding it all together. Yeah.
And who are we to create those boundaries and those borders for God? Like who are we?
It seems to go poorly for us every time we try to do it. Golden calf.
All right.
Other observations or thoughts or questions?
I just have one thought now that you've raised an issue with me, because in Genesis, God makes man in his own image. And now it seems to me that the writers are beginning to make God in human image with feelings.
Oh, well, or is that part of what they understood about the nature of this God, is that feelings are not disconnected from the divine. In fact, it seems like this God, that part of the image and nature of human beings reflecting the image and nature of God is our capacity for feeling. It's some of the deal. It's part of what it means to be made in this God's image.
John Shields had a comment about feelings this morning while he was talking about love and divine love in his sermon. I'd recommend anybody who didn't catch the sermon this morning to go back and listen to it, because he made a point about talking about how we often associate love as a feeling, which it is a feeling. Like, there are feelings attached to love, but love as a category is affected by feelings, and yet it is beyond feelings and bigger than feelings. And I think the same is true for your point now about the essence of God.
Yeah.
You know, God it does have a sense of feeling, but is bigger than that, and, you know, goes beyond that.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, let's let that be the last word. Everyone, thank you so much. Thanks for sticking around and reading some Noah. Next week, Tower of Babel, and then out.